Speaker, it's a pleasure to speak in support of Bill C-45 at the report stage debate. This historic bill represents a positive first step in the complex process of legalizing, strictly regulating, and restricting access to cannabis. Since the introduction of this bill, it has been emphasized that the approach proposed by the bill is grounded in the basis of public health and public safety, including the goal of keeping cannabis away from young people. Consistent with the commitments to protect the well-being of Canadians, our government introduced companion legislation, Bill C-46, that targets those who drive while impaired by drugs. This distinct piece of proposed legislation would strengthen the criminal law response to drug-impaired driving and help to increase the safety of our public streets and roads. It is in consideration of Bill C-45, the Standing Committee on Health heard from the Ontario Public Health Association that, quote, impaired driving is a leading criminal cause of death and injury on our roadways, and cannabinoids are among the most common psychoactive substances found in deceased and injured drivers in Canada. Mr. Speaker, despite having made progress in deterring and reducing the amount of alcohol-impaired driving over the past decades, statistics indicate that drug-impaired driving is actually increasing. And Mr. Speaker, I am fortunate enough to be a member of the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights, and we studied the companion legislation to Bill C-45, that being Bill C-46, that was referred to our committee. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, it is obvious that there is a problem on our roads today with drug-impaired driving, and the problem under the current system keeps getting worse. According to Statistics Canada, of the more than 72,000 police-reported impaired driving incidents in 2015, almost 3,000 of those were related to drugs. This may not seem like a large proportion, but when you consider that this is double the amount of drug-impaired driving incidents since just 2009, the upward trend becomes very worrisome. According to a recent publication by the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, 20% of cannabis users self-report as having driven at least once within 2 hours of using cannabis. Another recent study based on the Victoria Healthy Youth Survey in British Columbia indicates that 64% of males and 33% of females who were heavy users of cannabis reported that they drove while drug impaired. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the Ontario Student Drug Use and Health Survey of 2015 reported that the percentage of drivers in grades 10 to 12 who reported driving after consuming cannabis was higher than those who reported driving after consuming alcohol. This survey further indicated that an estimated 29,500 adolescent drivers in Ontario alone drove within 1 hour after consuming cannabis within the previous year. I think I can speak for all of us, Mr. Speaker, when I say that I find this to be very troubling. The fact that driving while impaired by drugs is currently a criminal offence punishable by a mandatory minimum fine of $1,000 on a first offence does not seem to be a sufficient deterrent for an increasing number of drivers. But the penalty is not the whole answer anyway. What is clear to me, and what the preponderance of the evidence demonstrates, is that it is the fear of getting caught that acts as the real deterrent to impaired driving. Given the current statistics on cannabis consumption before driving, Mr. Speaker, I am fully supportive of the government's approach to strengthen the criminal law framework addressing drug-impaired driving. The proposals on impaired driving would authorize a new tool for police officers to better detect drivers with drugs in their body. These devices would determine whether or not a driver has certain drugs in their oral fluid, including THC, which is the impairing compound of cannabis. The presence of THC in oral fluid is a strong indicator that cannabis was recently consumed and therefore provides useful information to a police officer who is conducting a roadside investigation. Again, what is essential here is that the public knows they will be much more likely to get caught if they drive while impaired by cannabis. This will act as a real deterrent and keep our roads safer. Mr. Speaker, while reviewing Bill C-45, the Health Committee members heard from the Public Safety Minister, who recognized that, and I quote, "Essential to this new regime is engagement with and support for police and border officers to ensure that they have the tools they need to enforce the law." To this end, the government recently announced an investment of $274 million to support law enforcement and border efforts to both detect and deter drug-impaired driving and for enforcement of the proposed cannabis legalization and regulation scheme. Provinces and territories will be able to access up to $81 million over the next 5 years for new law enforcement training and to build capacity and enforce new and stronger laws related to drug-impaired driving. The Impaired Driving Bill also proposes new legal limit offences for drugs and driving. Once these offences are enacted, the Crown will no longer have to prove that a driver was impaired by a drug if an analysis of their blood showed that they had a prohibited level of drugs in their body. This legal efficiency would provide a much more timely way to prosecute and punish those who choose to mix impairing drugs with driving activity. I am pleased to note that one of the proposed offences prohibits certain levels of alcohol and THC, which, as I indicated earlier, is a particularly impairing combination of substances. This proposed offence would send a strong message against driving after mixing cannabis with alcohol. In my view, Mr. Speaker, the proposals to address drug-impaired driving are a positive reflection of the government's broader approach to cannabis legalization in that they represent a cautious, public safety-driven response with the ultimate goal of public protection. Mr. Speaker, to reiterate the Minister of Public Safety's remarks to the Health Committee, and I quote, "Cannabis-impaired driving is happening on our streets right now. The faster we get the right tools, the funding, the training, and the legislative and regulatory authorities in place, the safer Canadians will be. Legislative delay does not make the problem go away or get any better." Mr. Speaker, at committee, amendments were adopted to require a review of both Bills C-45 and C-46 3 years after coming into force and to table reports before Parliament on the results of these reviews. This will allow the government to clearly communicate the impacts of the new legislation and to determine whether future changes are necessary. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to recognize the substantial efforts of the government to fulfill two of its key platform commitments to legalize cannabis and also, and importantly, to create new and stronger laws to apprehend and actually deter those who would otherwise drive while under the influence. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, it is critical to underscore the objectives of Bill C-45, which is designed to legalize, strictly regulate, and restrict access to cannabis. With the highest usage of young people using cannabis in the developed world, it is clear that the current system is not working. We must make it harder for young people to access cannabis, take business away from criminals, and put public health and safety front and centre. That's what Bill C-45 does, and that's why all members should support this important legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.